Hi, I'm Imogen Blood, and in this episode of Change Talk, I'm joined by my long-standing associate Mark Goldup. In the wake of the new guidance for local authorities on producing supported housing strategies, it felt like a good time to talk about the Housing and Support Needs Assessment Model, also known as HASNAM, which Mark has been developing in partnership with Homeless Link and us at Imogen Blood and Associates for many years. After working in operational roles at Stonham Housing Association for about a dozen years, Mark gradually gravitated towards consultancy. He spent the last 20 odd years refining methods to assess the need for supported housing, with a particular focus on transitional supported housing, where there's an expectation that people will move on within a reasonably short time frame. In this podcast, we reflect on the benefits of taking a strategic approach, and Mark shares his expertise on how to tackle the different stages of a needs assessment as described in the new guidance. And we end up by reflecting on what Mark has learned about the state of the supported housing sector and some of the issues it faces through these many years of collecting evidence. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So, I'm delighted to welcome today my long-standing colleague and associate Mark Goldup to Change Talk. Hi, Mark.
Hello, hi.
And we're going to be talking today about supported housing needs assessment, a topic which has been dear to both of our hearts for many years, hasn't it, Mark? And
Indeed, yes. Too many years, yes.
yes, quite. And just felt like a really good time to dive into this topic. The Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Act, which did get passed a few years ago, but is only really just now kind of gaining momentum. This new statutory duties come in for local authorities to publish their local supported housing strategies.
hmm
And Mark, this is obviously a topic you've been working on and thinking about for literally decades of your career.
20 years, I'd say, yes.
20 years, wow. And it just felt like, with lots of people trying to work out what the new guidance means and how to do it and how to kind of renew previous attempts they've made at needs assessment, now would be a really opportune moment to reflect a little bit on your thinking and the model that you've developed for
hmm
doing those needs assessments. But I thought perhaps we just start off a little bit by thinking about, why it's important to take a strategic approach to supported housing, and what the
Yeah,
benefits are of doing that locally,
yeah,
really,
yeah.
and
Okay.
what that can look like if we do it well, and what the risks are
hmm
if we don't.
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, it's always been important to take a more strategic approach to anything, really. But I mean, I think supported housing has potentially a significant contribution to make to a whole range of different issues, a whole range of different demands on public services, and a whole different range of agencies. Perhaps including particularly, I think, health agencies and criminal justice agencies as well as obviously helping to meet homelessness, to support strategies to end homelessness and provide people with stable long-term housing. Um, but in order to do that, really, in order to be effective in that, it needs to link into a whole range of other networks, not to operate in isolation, um, and perhaps, in particular, to ensure that the right people receive the right service at the right time,
Mm.
and therefore not only to get the kind of the best value out of the resource, both for housing agencies, but also the other agencies that potentially benefit enormously from supported housing, but also for the individuals, because while it is a resource that has enormous potential, I think, to make a difference in lots of ways, it is also there's plenty of experience and plenty of evidence that it isn't always the most effective for every individual that uses it.
Mm.
Um, and so I think a more strategic approach, which does try and ensure that the right people at the right place at the right time are receiving the service, is actually is a way of combating some of those potential problems that individuals have experienced in supported housing. But it's even more, even though that's always been the case. It's even more true now because of the way in which the sector has developed, and what I would describe as the kind of privatized supported housing that has grown significantly, in some places a lot more than others, but in some places that's very much now, supported housing, particularly in relation to homelessness and combating homelessness, more generic supported housing, if you like, the majority of that provision has not actually been commissioned by local authorities or indeed any other public body, has not been developed based on within any kind of strategic framework. And while a lot of it is potentially doing a lot of good work, and while there's a lot of organizations that do want to be a part of something wider, that's not how they've come about. And so there is an even greater challenge to make sure that you can use that resource effectively and in a kind of more coordinated and linked in way, and indeed in a strategic way. So I think the need for the supported housing strategy is even greater than it's ever been. I
Yeah.
think that's my answer.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And we are in this kind of, things have changed so much, I guess, since the end of supporting people and thinking about the way in which the sector has evolved. And obviously we've, seen and written about in lots of places that kind of contracting of commission services, within kind of budgetary pressures. And meanwhile, this sort of growing of a sector, some of which has obviously been decommissioned and some of which is kind of provider led. And as you say, there's a whole mix of provision in there, isn't there? But yeah, for a lot of authorities, just getting a handle really on what's out there actually is a really big challenge, isn't it? Just kind of even working out what's out there and who's in it really is actually
Yeah, yeah,
going to be a real
yeah. I
challenge. Yeah.
suppose I should have probably added, in terms of the risk, as you mentioned that. I mean, the risk of not being able to develop and impose, if you like, a strategic framework on all of this is essentially from the public sector, from a state, from society's point of view, if you like, that you're not getting best value out of, or indeed sometimes any value out of quite a significant and substantial resource that could make a difference. But for the individuals, the risk is that there's a lot of evidence about how people are stuck in the system and are kind of circling around it, and with all kinds of potential cost consequences of that as issues don't get addressed. And the risk, if you don't try and develop these sort of resources into something that gels together in some kind of coherent way, is that those individuals will continue to circle around the system with all the implications for them as individuals, but also the costs that accrue from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And people in that provision can end up being quite hidden, can't they, really, from commissioners? And
Mm,
as you say, end up potentially in a kind of, well, stuck in a pathway that doesn't exist because there isn't
mm,
really a pathway
mm,
out of some
mm.
of those services that's been kind of formally developed and promoted within the local authority. So yeah, there are both human and financial reasons for getting
Mm.
this right, aren't there? Absolutely.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
as I mentioned at the start, obviously the guidance for producing the strategies just came out early in February. And as we expected, it requires local authorities to carry out a needs assessment to inform their strategy. And they need to look at the current availability of supported housing. They also need to project the likely need for supported housing over the next 5 years. And I think, in line with, what I think, a well-established way of thinking about the sector, certainly something that when I was involved in the supported accommodation review about a decade ago, we were quite clear that it would probably make sense to think about this hugely diverse supported housing sector, if you can even call it that, in relation to sort of three broad types. You've got your older people's supported housing, retirement housing, sheltered housing, extra care housing. And then you've got longer term services for people, usually people with a range of disabilities, often known as supported living. And then you've got your transitional supported housing, which, as you alluded to earlier, is again, a hugely broad church, isn't it? With everything from sort of women's refuges to kind of whole range of specialist mental health, transitional services, homelessness, services for young people, for substance use, whole kind of range of different client groups. And obviously that's where, although both of us have been involved in projects really thinking about both the older people's and the longer term supported housing sort of sectors. I guess it's that transitional sector that we've probably both most been involved in recent years. And I just wondered whether you'd like to say a bit more about why you think that needs a different approach from those other kind of longer term models. What?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think there are a number of reasons for that, all of which are kind of related to each other, linked together. But perhaps the most important reason is that I think in relation to older people's housing or older people housing with support attached, or those that supported living, as you say, for people with eligible Care Act eligible needs. The difference is that a lot of that, the need for that, if you like, is probably measurable through some kind of prevalence measure, whether that be about the prevalence of different disabilities, or the prevalence of frailty among older people, or things about their ability to manage activities of daily living or whatever, and quite a lot of the basis, if you like, for the demand for those services is something which isn't necessarily going to change once it has developed. But supported housing that's there to support people who've experienced homelessness or other forms of social exclusion is really responding more to what I would describe as incidence factors. So which cannot really be deduced from kind of population profiling. It's more about measuring events or than it is about conditions, if you like, of which are something which you you can measure at scale and deduce with a degree of accuracy from sort of any kind of typical population, if you like. So, and also that there's an inevitability about, if you like, some of the conditions. So yes, I'm afraid it is kind of fairly inevitable that as an older person, as we get old, that proportionally a significant number of us will experience the kind of frailty or the kind of needs that supported housing is designed to meet. Actually experiencing homelessness and linked perhaps to particular substance use pattern is not inevitable. It actually is something which you can affect and which you can potentially change. So it just doesn't have the same kind of when you're estimating needs that arise from those kind of incidences, it doesn't have the same kind of certainty, and it certainly, I think, it doesn't. It requires a different approach, and kind of linked to that is the absence actually of sort of readily available data to actually inform that needs assessment. So for the reasons that I've given, a lot of prevalence information is actually available. It's obviously there are then challenges about how you manipulate that, how you interpret that, but basically it's there. Whereas and certainly this is the experience over many years of looking at this that the data really isn't there to actually inform the more incidence related approach. And so it actually in fact it's none of the, or virtually none, I would say, of any sort of data systems that have been set up to monitor activity in relation to homelessness would actually be able to say how many of those people was supported housing and what type of supported housing was actually appropriate to meet that need. So I think, and also time is also a really important factor in transitional supported housing in a way that isn't quite the same in relation to the other types. And by that I mean, how long actually somebody needs supported housing for makes a very, very significant difference to the bottom line calculations about how much you need. Whereas that doesn't really apply in quite the same way. Obviously, it is a factor that you would take into account probably in the other types of needs assessment for the other types of supported housing, but it's absolutely central and crucial. And finding a way to actually to measure that is quite a methodological challenge as well. So all of that leads to a number of kind of conclusions about what you need to do. It needs to track events rather than population. So it's actually about tracking incidents. But also, I think it probably needs a degree of original research to try and actually inform, not just trying to count the numbers, but also address that kind of issue about the potential for change. Does it have to be the same way? Just because you had 200 people presenting at housing options or whatever that are then referred on to supported housing, what would be the what is the potential for actually that to reduce to 100 next year because you've done other things elsewhere in the system. So I think there are a number of reasons why you need a different approach.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess I was just kind of reflecting as you were talking that I suppose, the data set that might get used mostly for trying to think about this is various forms of the official homelessness statistics, the HCLIC data set, that kind of statutory presentations to housing options. And obviously in some areas that can give us, depends a little bit how that system is configured, doesn't it? Some areas it can give us some insights, but it's problematic, isn't it, in terms of just using that as it gives us quite limited amounts of information really, and I suppose there might be questions about its accuracy around people's support needs. Is that fair to say based on your experience? I mean, do you think it can give us a guide or?
I think it's very the support needs in itself, it was a major step forward, and certainly when I started kind of looking at how to develop needs assessments under the supported people regime many years ago, that wasn't available, and it certainly is a sort of rich source of data that is a major step forward. But nevertheless, certainly when it comes to looking at support needs, that's very headline stuff. It doesn't. And for example, it will record something about whether people have a mental health support need related to their mental health, for example. How well how informed that judgment is another question. But even if it was incredibly informed and incredibly reliable, it doesn't actually tell you what kind of service they need.
No.
At all.
No. And you might
In fact,
argue
it
that,
tells you nothing about the kind of service they need. So.
And you might argue that, virtually everybody coming through that system is going to be experiencing some form of mental health challenge at that point in time, just from the fact that they're homeless. But there's obviously an enormous kind of range, isn't there, from people with, really substantial mental health conditions to, so it can give us just a very broad headline at kind of at that system level. And then of course it also begs the question, are people presenting at housing options? Is that being captured? So there's all sorts of ways in which it's a very blunt instrument, isn't it, for actually working out something as nuanced as planning a housing supported related housing system. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So well, just kind of, I thought it would be useful if we just thought about the different steps that the new guidance has set out. And the first one, which we know from our many projects together is easily rolls off the tongue, but is often the most challenging bit of it actually, is, to map the current supply of supported housing. I mean, we've already touched on the fact that, in some areas there's quite a lot of non-commission provision and, different authorities have got a handle on that to different degrees. But, the whole of that mapping piece is fraught with issues, isn't it? Do you want to, share a few of your reflections on that stage?
Yes. Well, this could probably form a kind of session in itself, to be honest, but it'd be pretty boring because some of it is quite technical. But it really is much more difficult than people imagine to actually get an accurate supply map of supported housing. Sometimes it is quite difficult to understand quite why that is, but I think probably the main reasons are probably twofold. Really, main reasons is one is around the sort of complexity and variety of the arrangements in which the supported housing is delivered, or and to give an example of the implications of that is that the kind of the split, the quite common situation where there's a split between the landlord who provides the housing effectively, and the support provider who provides the support. And there are lots of different ways in which that can work out as well. You know, there are lots of different balances in terms of responsibilities and ways in which they're delivered. But for example, that will then mean potentially that means that, you know, there are two parts of the local authority which have one part that might know about the landlords, one part who might know about the support providers, and the whole process of matching those up so that, you know, you're talking about the same provision is really difficult, particularly as those different elements of the authority will actually have different, not just different names of organizations or whatever, but they'll have different numbers. They'll have different numbers of units, because one part might be looking at, you know, the number of care packages that they've commissioned, which will vary and varies all the time, you know, and one will be looking at benefit claims, which also vary potentially and vary all the time. So actually the matching up can be quite difficult. I think the other main reason why it's difficult is the whole kind of flexible nature, if you like, of supported housing provision, particularly I think in relation to the kind of homelessness sector rather than the social care sector, which means that numbers of, you know, changes are happening all the time. So you know, by the time you've started counting at one end, you know, the ones you've already counted, by the time you get to the end, the other ones you've already counted will have changed significantly. You know, bed spaces come in and out of management for all kinds of reasons all the time. Different ways, different configurations of service, things being changed, different target client groups, different levels of support. You know, it's this constant flux of change, which makes it very difficult. And that's before you start talking about definitional problems about what do we actually mean by supported housing, and which you can sort of is always, you know, put in a way which is sort of really straightforward. Well, it's just about housing where people get support, isn't it? More or less, that's what the definition is. But actually, on the ground, different configurations of the way in which that is done can be quite challenging about what you actually include within supported housing. And then there's the fact, there's also the nature of the market itself, where we're talking about, on the whole, we are talking about, particularly in the privatized sector, lots and lots of individuals, small providers, and lots of people to contact, lots of people where all those potentials for change and different ways of doing things are you know, has that its implication. Organizations merging, organizations being taken over, organizations changing their name, all those, and that's all just on the very you know, the difficulties of the basic fundamental, you know, how many bed spaces have you got, how many units have you got, before you then start looking at. But it's also really important within mapping supply, and you know, you can get sidetracked by all those kind of difficulties. But it's also important to stress that mapping supply is not just about counting numbers of bed spaces or number of units. You actually need to know more. You need to know what they're actually providing and who they're providing for. Because if you're going and what their potential, if you like, for change or whatever, and how they link into the wider system, and what kind of relationships they have, and what kind of follow-on support they might provide for residents, etc. Because if you're going to then use that supply map to compare to what you've identified as the need going forwards, you have to have that kind of information as well. So it is an absolute major task, and I would say in terms of time and in terms of resource required to get it right, it's actually the most significant of all the things. It's not the most interesting, but in terms of how time consuming and how challenging it is, I think it's probably the number one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were involved, weren't we, last year in a really complex piece of work for the Greater London Authority, trying to sort of map specialist mental health supported housing across the whole of London. And I don't think we ever thought it was going to be easy, actually. But there were
Yeah.
there were some real twists and turns along the way, weren't there? We started off thinking, oh, we'll ask commissioners, how much stuff they're contracting. So we sort of, it was enough of a job to find a commissioner contact and get in touch with them and ask them how much they're commissioning. And then we were like, this is odd. Some of them aren't contracting
Mm.
anything. There must be something going on. And then we discovered a whole other kind of, we just kept finding new layers, didn't we? We were like, oh, actually, there's all this spot commissioning going on from different parts of integrated care and local authority teams, or from a different bit of the local authority that actually the bit you were first talking to weren't really aware of what they were doing or only had the slightest idea. And it became, and yeah, that just even down to the difference between a unit and a scheme. Some schemes have,
Yes.
130 individual homes in a community, and others,
Yeah.
a scheme is like a complex with,
Yeah.
10 beds in it. And
Yeah.
it was, and before you even get into trying to interpret everybody's idea of what their own support model looks like, and people
Yes.
bouncy around terms like high, low, medium, and you've no idea whether one person's high is another person's low. And yeah,
Yes.
it's
Yes.
it's a big job, isn't it? Just,
Yes.
there isn't a kind of, well, a sort of established typology for any of this, is there? So trying to sort of, shoehorn things together at that starting point is really complex.
And I suppose you kind of touch upon something sort of important there is a large part of the model that I have developed to try and assist people to do this does, in a sense, have it in a number of different ways, has a kind of typology which actually helps you to describe both what's there and indeed then what you think is needed in comparison to that. So yeah, that's without going into the detail about
Yeah, yeah,
what that involves, that's been a major part of the development of the model, which is trying to impose something informed by many years working in the sector, and indeed from other people's inputs and things as well, but is trying to impose some kind of framework upon all of this, which actually makes it manageable and doable,
yeah.
even if still time consuming.
Yeah, and if you can get that kind of right at the mapping, well, right, as accurate as possible at the mapping stage, as you say, the bit we'll come on to later when you're looking at that net need, projected need becomes a lot easier, doesn't it? And worth thrashing all of that out probably in that early stage. So the next bit of the guidance says that the needs assessment should understand the potential wider housing with care and support population, and you have touched already on the model that you've produced, Mark. I mean, that the HASNAM model, housing and support needs assessment model, which obviously I'll put the link to in the at the bottom of the video. But in that model, you've described this, I think it's fair to say, as the population at risk. And
Yep.
I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about how a local authority might define and estimate the size of this potential population when it's thinking about its transitional supported housing.
Okay. Because I've said for these services, it's based on incidents, it's based on events of rather than on conditions or characteristics, population characteristics. I think the population at risk for this is really if you like, the numbers of people who are presenting in need of some assistance because they have experienced homelessness or the risk of homelessness, and also they have some additional need for assistance in order to be able to resolve that and ultimately find a stable housing solution. So the population at risk of the people are either and how you would find or enumerate, count, or measure that the size of that population at risk is about finding places where either agencies that know about people, because like, for example, aftercare teams within children's social care, or places where people would present, such as most obvious place being housing options or housing solutions at the local authority, but also other helplines or specialist advice services for people with substance use or misuse or relation to the criminal justice system, or agencies that contact people who are sleeping on the streets, or other forms of outreach, a whole range of different places, but where people with those either at risk or having experienced homelessness, and those that potential need for assistance to resolve it, places where they would present, and that essentially would be your population at risk. So it's not about cutting into the population at a particular moment in time. It's about measuring the volume of that over a period of time, which we normally do over 12 months for kind of conventional reasons. So I think that's the population at risk, which obviously is very different and doesn't in itself tell you about the proportion of that population that actually specifically needs supported housing, or the different sorts or different types of supported housing that they might need. That's a further step, but it is the starting point. And you always have to also allow, for the possibility that within that people might go direct to the providers of I mean, obviously it's different in different places, but there's usually an element of that, and sometimes a very strong element of that. So actually, sometimes the best way of measuring the population at risk is actually to find out who is approaching providers directly. So it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah, especially if you've got a lot of non-commissioned provision. There's going to be, and of course it gets really tricky, doesn't it, when you've got providers holding their own waiting lists and you've got referrals coming in potentially scattergun. Everybody kind of gets into the habit that you refer to all of the available places, so you've no idea. If people appear on several referral lists, and then you've got people that present at an advice agency here and either do or don't convert through into a housing options approach. It's pretty messy, isn't it? How do you take account of all of that kind of messiness of flow and potential for duplication? How do you, it's really tricky.
It certainly is a major issue. And that's true whether you are trying to get that information from the kind of agencies that I'm talking about, where they may, the same individual might appear in different sets of numbers quite clearly. It's also very, even in a sense, even more if you're going directly to the providers, where the same person might go to 3 different providers, and therefore actually even if you were able to count all the referrals made into supported housing, they may be 3 times as great as actually the number of unique individuals, or 4 times as great, or whatever. So it is absolutely crucial to the whole approach to find ways to identify the duplication. But it is actually, and perhaps the major reason in many ways to why a significant degree of original research, asking direct questions is important. Now, obviously, if you are asking housing options and the criminal rehabilitation, the rehabilitation service, or the helpline there, or whatever, or the outreach team, or whatever, if you're asking all those people those questions, you can ask a question which says how many of those people have been seen by. And what we normally do is we take housing options as the core, or the local authority homelessness service as the core agency, if you like. So we seek to identify the number of people who've gone through a different route who have been seen by housing options. So we take them, if you like, their numbers as the starting point, and therefore we then ignore a proportion of the information that we get from the other agencies. And if we're looking at the referral, if it's referrals direct to supported housing, we again use those surveys of individual agencies such as housing options or advice services. We ask, well, how those people who you have referred to supported housing, how many times have you referred them? So it gives us a kind of evidence base to apply a not multiplier, whatever the opposite of multiplier
deflator
is. Deflator, that's the word. Thank you very much.
Both, isn't there? So there might be there might be a multiplier there, or a deflator if there are to take account of the repeat referrals, especially over a year, because some people come around the system multiple times, don't we, as we touched on earlier. And but also, oh, now it's making my head hurt, a deflator, no, sorry, a multiplier where we find that there are people who are coming in from other referral routes and then perhaps not coming via housing options. If we can get a sense of what
Yes.
the volume of that is out
Yes.
with the housing options
Yeah.
system, we can,
Yeah.
no, that makes a lot of sense.
But it
Yeah.
certainly is core to the approach. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So far so good, really time consuming, tricky, lots of definitional mapping stage. We've got to kind of iron out the multiplication deflation thing when we come to think about this population at risk. Um, but then I guess the bit that I think is probably the most challenging, and you have touched on it already, and I think this is the bit where your model really does, make a massive difference. I mean, I've looked at lots of supported housing needs assessments where, having done that piece of work that you've just described, the next bit is like, okay, what's the so what? What do these people actually potentially need? And sometimes I've seen approaches where, the existing kind of ratio and balance of different types of support models is then sort of layered over um, the kind of
Yes.
population in need, and then we assume that that's what's needed moving forwards. And I can see why that doesn't work for all sorts of reasons, because as we said earlier, this is a really dynamic system, and we don't want to sort of assume that we're going to kind of keep replicating the current situation, especially if the current situation isn't working very well and lots of people are coming through the front door and then getting stuck. So tell us a little bit more about how your
Mm,
HASNAM model really helps people to
mm,
get from the population at need to not only how many of those people might actually need a housing related support offer, but really excitingly, what type of housing related support offer they
mm,
might need.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, you're absolutely right. So the actual need for supported housing has never been measured in a consistent and regular way, and actually, I don't think actually it ever could. I don't think that's a
Mm.
criticism or a weakness. I think it's actually not possible, or that's certainly the conclusion that I came to within in doing this work over many years and trying to get data systems to stretch to try and sort of where can you find indicators that will give you that kind of additional bit of nuance which actually enables you to translate some of those population at risk numbers into an actual need for an actual service. And I decided it was impossible. It just was never going to work, and it just ended up trying to you got something which was very convoluted, and the more convoluted it got, the less robust and the less convincing it became. So the kind of the big breakthrough, if you like, which I think is the methodology that I've developed through the HASNAM model, is the idea of a snapshot survey. So a snapshot survey is actually looking at the needs of actual individuals at a particular moment in time. Individuals who are either receiving a supported housing service or looking for a supported housing service. So, and it allows you to go into a lot more depth than would ever be possible in terms of regular ongoing monitoring systems. The whole kind of operation. If the kind of questions that I'm able to ask on a snapshot basis, and I'll talk a little bit in a moment about how we do it as well in a way that makes it doable.
Mm.
But those kind of questions that on a regular basis, recording people would just not work. It also actually it just not be feasible to do that. So it allows you to go into much more detail. It also gives a kind of a different picture. It gives a picture of a moment in time, if you like. This is the range of needs that exist at the moment. And we work on a basis, and if you have sufficient volume and get sufficient level of response that that you think is typical of the situation at that moment in time, it works on the principle that that is also typical of all the moments of time over a period of time. And so what it enables you to do is to actually look in so much more, and it also allows you, to ask specific, precise, targeted questions, which actually give you the answers that you're looking for, rather than trying to use data which is collected for other purposes and then making interpretations or assumptions based on that.
Yeah.
So what that then allows you to do is to then apply that back to the first set of data that you collected about numbers of people going through the system at various points, the population at risk, if you like, and it allows you to say, well, we may have had 1,000 people going through. We've now done a survey of 150 people at this moment in time, and this produces this kind of balance of needs. And then you apply that back to the thousands and say, well, that number of percent over time. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the essential principle, and therefore it gives you a level of robustness and certainty, and takes you that step further in terms of going from population at risk to population in need. So yeah, and the way in which we make it doable, and it does seem to be doable because I've done it many times over now, and we do get really good response rates. It can take some time to sort of chasing and various people chasing as well is obviously really important. Make sure you are chasing the right person, and there's all kinds of logistical issues about, but it does actually work, and we're convinced that from the answers, because of the way they're set up, it's the caseworkers, the support workers, the frontline workers, the people who know the individuals best, who are actually completing it. That's really important. And the other thing is that because it's all multiple choice, and it's multiple choice questions that have evolved over a period of time to actually kind of make sense to people, hopefully, people choose the sentence which most applies to that particular case. But all the evidence suggests that people do take it seriously, and they do answer it as honestly and with the level of expertise, and because those are the most, that's where the most expertise lies. So while it is subjective, we think it's as a reliable and as good a way of finding out the answer to that question as any other, in fact better than any other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we both started our careers in frontline supported housing. We get what it looks like and what that job involves, and just how much insight you have at that individual level. And one of the things that's, I think, great about the survey is that it, doesn't require. I mean, if you're working with a, say you've got half a dozen people on your key working caseload in a hostel, or maybe even 10, 20, but those people pretty well. You don't actually have to go and look anything up. We're not asking for any sort of personal data, obviously for GDPR reasons, and we're also not sort of asking anything that anyone's got to go and double check. So it's all sort of quick insight stuff, isn't it? And yeah, although I always feel really sort of torn. On the one hand, I feel, these frontline workers, we know just how tough it is in services at the moment, how, chronic issues of understaffing, people are really up against it. But on the other hand, we know how much insight there is in that kind of, in that whole kind of workforce. And it feels like you've designed a way of kind of extracting that insight in the kind of least painful way possible, and then using it to create the evidence base, rather than just pulling numbers out of a public health data set, and drawing.
And it's almost like the combination, because a lot of the things that people have to choose from in terms of the options are kind of like sentences.
Yeah.
Reasonably long sentences. But of course, once you've looked at that once, and you have to absorb it, it becomes, as you go on, it becomes easier and easier because you actually know what it says. But it's almost like it's the combination of like that individual description that you would get, so the qualitative, if you like, with the ability to then be able to analyze, to create analysis of that, because that is all translated into numbers. So that, I think, is also, I probably haven't explained that brilliantly, but
no, that
it's almost getting the best of both worlds, both a sort of semi, at least, qualitative description of people's needs, and of course every individual is different, but also a way of translating that into numbers, and particularly if you get substantial and significant sample sizes, then that also is, it's not like a case study approach where you might go into more detail of 10 cases or anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think we've often, we always have this discussion, don't we, about have we reached a big enough sample size? I mean, obviously there's a whole load of stats stuff you can say about that, but just at a kind of, Yeah, just in an instinctive level, it does feel as though the depth of information that you get out of this exercise, when you think about the depth multiplied by, maybe 300 responses or
Yeah.
whatever, depending on the size of the system, you think, yeah, actually, that's a significant amount of
Yes.
information that you can play around with. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just that sort of point about, I mean, obviously, I think in those early days, it's like, I know certainly on some of those projects we worked on together, there's so much you could do with that information, isn't there? There's so many different sort of cross tabulations you can run. It's like, wow, where do we start? But you've over time really kind of honed that and linked it back into that typology that you touched on earlier, haven't you? Do you just want to
Yeah.
say a little bit more about that with obviously without, I mean, there's a huge amount of detail which you could give, but just give people a flavor of how that works.
Um, well, I suppose there are kind of parallel streams actually from this. While there is a kind of a stream which does use that data, both the bits collected at the beginning about what's been happening within the system, but also over time, but also this in-depth information that you get from a snapshot in time. There is a kind of stream by which that actually does lead to in a transparent way, and in a way which where we make obvious the assumptions and where we've got those assumptions from, a series of steps that does leads to numbers. We think you need this kind of number of different types of supported housing. But then there's also there are other streams that as almost incidentally, if you like, that come out of it in terms of giving you a good idea about the profile of people both looking for services and some of those that are finding difficulty in getting access to services, but also then the profile of people who are in supported housing and, for example, are having enormous difficulty about then finding the next step. And one of the key parts of the snapshot is looking at, well, who is actually ready to move out of transitional supported housing now? What kind of service or what kind of next step are they looking for? What are the particular issues that need to be taken into account in finding the right next step? And what are the difficulties that are being experienced? So a whole host of experience of evidence and intelligence that about what's currently happening that can then inform that strategy. So much more than just a kind of broad estimate about what type of supported housing you need, and do you need more or do you need less, or do you need it in a different location or whatever. All of that is there, but there's a lot more as well. And about another, just to give another example, because it tracks where people have come from, what were their previous circumstances. So it actually gives you some intelligence about, well, where could we have actually intervened in order to be able to prevent this person ever becoming homeless and being diverted, therefore, from supported housing in the first place, because you've actually intervened separately. So it just gives you a lot of intelligence that can be almost, as you say, endlessly analysed and if there are a particular group of people that are if there are having a particular difficulty in finding next steps accommodation, for example, then you can look, because there's information there about their case history, where they came from, who they were referred by, and all that kind of stuff. You can begin to say, well, what are the characteristics of this cohort of people that are having difficulty finding further move on accommodation or next step accommodation, which actually then gives you some basis upon which to say, well, what can we actually do about it?
Yeah, yeah, those it's so important at both ends of that journey, aren't they? Because
Yeah.
as we sort of touched on earlier, it's the amount of transitional supported housing we need in any system depends not only on, of course, all our policies and socioeconomics and the amount of housing we've got, but it also depends on how good we are at preventing people from entering that kind of population at need, aren't we? And population at risk, and also how effective we are as a system in moving people on when they no longer need the support. And yeah, providing a real evidence-based pathway of recommendations for areas around how they can improve performance at both ends of that. Hopefully, if you can get your system working really well, you end up needing rather less and using what you have better. Just maybe just a quick thought on some of those kind of overlapping groups, because of course one of the challenges is, and this is when you see government lists, you end up with all these, you've got care leavers, you've got substance abuse, you've got people with mental health issues, you've got great long lists of sort of subgroups of client groups underneath, the whole kind of broad church of transitional supported housing. How does your model kind of deal with those different groups? What does it, how do you kind of conceptualize those different client groups? Do you use them?
Um, yes, in a number of in a number of ways, or the kind of the characteristics of the people who are looking for and receiving a supported housing service are analysed at a lot more detail, if you like, than just a simple kind of client group allocation, which doesn't really tell you very much. But I suppose the other thing to say is it's kind of the other way round. From you don't start by separating people out and saying, right, we're going to look at that group who fall into this poorly defined because they probably fit into lots of different baskets or whatever. So you don't start by separating people out. You start by looking at the needs overall, but because you're monitoring the characteristics, you can then say, well, of these, the percent that you might, so many people you think have this kind of need for services at different points, whether that's now or whether that's when they move on or whatever. You can then say, because you have monitored whether they were a child, formerly a looked after child, for example, or that they have experienced domestic abuse or whatever, you can then actually you can then say, well, of that group of people, this percentage of them are from this cohort or whatever. So it's more, I think, that's part of the information that you're collecting at a much more sophisticated level than conventional client group labels.
Yeah, makes sense. And I suppose I can think that's, for example, helped us to highlight the number of domestic abuse survivors who are in, for want of a better word, generic homelessness settings, but actually not having their domestic abuse specific needs met, which is something, we've been able to highlight, because which of those places in the system you end up in is often quite a lottery, isn't it, really? Or it's decided on on the basis of assumed risks and needs. So yeah, no, that feels really important. And then I suppose finally the guidance asks local authorities to estimate the net additional supported housing need. We've talked quite a bit about that, but I suppose I just wondered whether you had any advice around how you then go about projecting that need forwards over a 5-year period. That's always quite tricky, isn't it? How do you approach that?
It is, but I suppose, there are fairly conventional approaches, if you like, to doing that, which we do make use of within the model. So looking at the implications of population change, obviously, but also trends in relation to particular. So, for example, trends in homelessness presentations or whatever would be a significant, and is usually we do use as a contributory factor. And what we do is we apply those a multiplier which takes into account those projected changes or trends in the kind of key variables, which we apply to the population at risk, basically the numbers that we talked about before. But there's nothing particularly radical or about that at all, right? But the really important thing I think that would stress is that you then we both encourage and enable through the model consideration about, well, what could be changed in order to make, we don't just assume that that's then going to carry on. That might affect the starting number, of people who are potentially in need, the population at risk. But what then happens to them, and what they're presented with, and what the options are, and how quickly they move through services, all of those things which affect the bottom line in terms of the numbers of units of service that are needed, are things that could potentially change.
Mm.
So it's about and the model is about structuring that process of considering what could we change in order to make a difference. If we could we intervene for this particular group to actually prevent them ever becoming homeless? Is that a realistic prospect that we should take into account? And what difference does that make in terms of the numbers going forward? Or what difference would it make if we were able to enable people to move on at the point at which they were ready to do so because of other changes that we make in the system? So it's the really important thing, and this is where a lot of conventional approaches to needs assessment just fall down, as far as I'm concerned, because they assume that nothing's going to change, apart from, if you like, the pressure coming in at the beginning, which as I say, we do allow for as well. But yeah, that's the main difference, I think, in what we try to do.
And being able to model those scenarios, I think, for commissioners who are trying to make a business case for investing more in prevention, or for doing things a little differently, or for actually, building more move on housing, rather than just building more and more provision at the front end. There's some really sort of rich kind of potential to run some of those models, aren't there? Which I think can be really, really powerful. So we'll come at the end perhaps to thinking about an example, but I suppose I just wanted, I mean, I'm aware that, well, between us both actually, but you in particular have built such a lot of kind of insight into how supported housing is working and where there are sort of common pitfalls within systems over all the many housing needs assessments you've done in this area. And I suppose I was really keen to make a bit of time to just reflect with you on what some of those sort of really key findings are. Obviously some systems are functioning better than others, but what kinds of things do you tend to find? What are the typical headlines around where things aren't working as well as they might?
Yes. Well, I think actually the first thing to mention is not so much about what's not working so well as the kind of reality of what supported housing is the finding that the proportion of people who do have either some form of disability or some form of health issue, even though we're not talking about services that are specifically commissioned for people with social care needs or health needs. These are kind of generic provision related mostly to homelessness or other forms of social exclusion. The proportion is very consistent, and we're talking about 75% probably of users. That's 3/4. That's 3-to-1 ratio between people who do have those conditions or experience and those that don't. And I think that's it's so consistent across hundreds and hundreds, thousands now of records, and that just tells you where supported housing is or should be in terms of its, it is a very significant resource particularly for health, I would say, and that's a really important finding, I think. In terms of things that don't work, the most obvious thing is the question about people's next steps. We tend to find at any one moment in time, and this is a moment in time, any one day, because it's the snapshot is the situation as of a particular date. And generally we are talking about between 40 and 50% of people living in generic homelessness related supported housing are judged by the support worker to be ready to move on that date. And that's really, really significant.
Huge.
And we do, we ask further. I mean, this system has evolved over time, and we now, we do ask how long, people think that the support worker thinks that's been the case for. And obviously for quite a few people, that's very recent situation. But a piece of work I did only last week is where I tried to use the data to work out what I thought the average length of time that people were effectively overstaying, which I think I worked out at about 3 months. Now, that's not a lot. It doesn't feel like a lot in a lifetime, but that has a major implication for how many units. If you were able to move people out at the point at which 3 months on average, and of course that's across hundreds and hundreds of cases,
Mm.
because that's what on
Mm,
average
mm,
is.
mm, mm.
You know, that would make a substantial difference to what you would need, but also it makes a substantial difference potentially to the individual.
Yeah.
We haven't got as much evidence about it, but you know, you can get some evidence there to show what the impact is, in terms of, you know, you know, if people aren't able to move on at the point at which they're actually ready to begin to go backwards again, basically. And the, you know, the incidences of you know, breakdown in tenancy and things increase, and some of the good work is undone. So I think those, I mean, that is probably the major thing. There are other sort of themes that are quite common about the numbers of people needing some kind of specialist input, because particularly because of their mental health being very, we have a category which talks about, you know, asking people whether people's mental health is fragile and subject to rapid change or deterioration or something like that. I can't remember the exact wording,
Yeah, sounds right.
you know, pretty severe, you know, people in serious situations, and you know, 10 to 20% of service users might meet that criteria according to the support workers, and they're giving other alternatives which would actually indicate, you know, that it's actually less significant than that, so that their mental health condition is less serious than that. So that's you know, that's a pretty important find and consistent finding, I would say as well. So it isn't necessarily, you know, in terms of development, it isn't necessarily about needing more supported housing, but it's about needing better joined up supported housing, I suppose,
Yeah,
basically.
absolutely. I'm always banging on about, you know, the need for a whole system kind of, you know, wrap around supported housing schemes, and of course the individuals that they're supporting. But you know, we see these schemes carrying such a lot of risk, you know, providing a, you know, well, you can't really call it a preventative service because people are at crisis, and that you know, the relief the relief duty has been enacted. But you know, from a health and social care perspective, providing a lot of kind of preventative input, yet often doing that with, you know, patchy at best support from those wider systems. So I just wanted to end up really by giving you a chance to mention, you know, an example of perhaps where you've used this work, and you know, obviously you've been using this model and continuing to use this model both with Homeless Link and with myself, and you know, we're sometimes, like as at the moment, we're partnering all three of us together to deliver a piece of work for Cornwall County Council, which is great. But yeah, do you want to just tell us a bit about some of the work you've done, Mark? You know, where you've been around the country, or where you think you've had
Yep.
a particularly interesting
Okay.
one? Mm.
Yep. I think I should have counted the number of local authorities. I think Homeless Link tend to say that we've worked with, I think we've worked with about 14 different local authorities now. It was first developed in I think, though there's a long history of some of these thoughts and some of these terms and some of these ideas, in any kind of coherent way, you know, the model that I'm now talking about really derives from a piece of work done with Hull City Council, when they were a part of some pilot program, which I can't
Yeah,
remember what it was
yeah.
called.
Might have been the supported housing improvement oversight
Yeah,
pilot.
that's right. Yeah,
Because I was,
before the SHIP program was
yeah,
established. That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yep. And you know, as a kind of measure of if you like the success of that, I suppose, is that they did invite us back again 3 years later to come and do a refresh. I mean, I think that has significantly impacted their basically their commissioning program, which I think is, and their relationships with non-commissioned providers, where they have a very substantial non-commissioned section, I think has benefited enormously from that process. I've got another example, more recent example, which is where we did some work with Kensington, Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea in London. And there I definitely do know that as a result of that exercise, again, if you like, the main impact is that it has influenced what they commission going forwards. They have commissioned at least one new service as a result of that, but also they were very much not engaged with their non-commissioned sector up to that, and That's probably not unusual for a London borough, I suspect. Not all, by the way,
No,
but
see, there's some that are
um,
doing a very good
yeah,
job of that, but
yeah, yeah,
lots of
yeah.
others are just starting to grapple with it, aren't
Yeah.
they?
And they have established, because we very much talk about using the results of the needs assessment to inform a kind of strategic conversation with non-commissioned providers, and actually to see them as potentially, obviously there are standards issues and there are some that you wouldn't want to enter into a relationship with, but there are a lot where that it does not apply, but where there is a need for that kind of conversation about what contribution they're actually going to make to a kind of the wider system. And Kensington and Chelsea have certainly embraced um, um, that approach, and that's kind of really positive to see. And as a result of that, they feel they have much more of a pathway or different set of pathways that people can go through, so that those resources are kind of appropriate, if you like, for the individual at that point in their pathway, which doesn't mean that they have to go through a series of steps necessarily to get ultimately to some kind of stable housing, but it does mean that those different resources are related to each other, and that individuals are able to um, choose, if you like, the right route ultimately to more settled housing. So I think there are a number of initiatives, and that's probably a good example of where they've actually used the system, which has actually, since that we worked there, has developed a bit more in terms of its sophistication and its capacity to deliver evidence. So hopefully, even more, future clients will benefit even more.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really good. And of course, your Hull example famously makes it into the guidance itself
It
as a good
does.
practice
It
example.
does.
So that's
Yes, it
very
does.
exciting, Mark.
Yes.
So yeah, brilliant. Well, I think that's given people some food for thought, I hope, and hope to people help people to those local authorities who are grappling with, how they can strengthen their approach in this. They've got a lot to do over the next year, but they have now for once got some resource to do it. And so, I'm hoping that we can see, some real kind of strategic, evidence-based thinking across the sector now. And really great to hear your bit more about your model, Mark, and how that can help. So thank you very much for
Okay.
your time.
Good. Pleasure.
Thanks a lot then.
All
Bye.
right. Yeah. Bye. Bye.